Hello. Thank you for that introduction. As was said, we are a research team from the University of Sydney. And we're here because last year the Australian government gave us $500,000 to spend 3 years studying this field, specifically with the goal of developing proactive public interest frameworks for governing XR technologies. And so what we've been doing and what we're planning to do is a lot of academic empirical research, talking to users, companies, and policymakers. But this kind of work poses a specific challenge. It's very hard to work out how to govern something well when that object that you're trying to govern doesn't exist yet. It hasn't fully evolved. And so what we've found in our work is that anticipatory sort of governance can be informed by historical technologies and trends in the development of other technologies. So that's what we've been doing. And we've been looking at how other technologies have evolved and the issues, and we're finding that it's a similar set of issues that we can see around things like data and privacy, trust and safety, participation, accessibility, those sort of things. So I'm going to put a few questions to my team here, and then I'm also keen to hear if anyone in the audience has questions as well. But so my first question is, what can XR developers, companies, innovators learn from the 2 decades of the social media era? So I might start with Ben.
Cool. Hi, everyone. So as we've been doing this project, one of the things that we've been really focused on is this question of data and privacy. So when we think about XR, whether it's VR, AR, or whatever, the narrative is often about like kind of frictionlessness and convenience and this notion that the technology inherently lets you just do things in a better way that you wouldn't have ordinarily been able to do if you weren't using it. And I think that the thing that is really important to be considering here is at what cost. So at the cost that we've been particularly interested in one stream of this project is that question of data and privacy, right? So we do have the slide up there. So yeah, I'm just going to steal a line from that book on the left there that I wrote with my colleague, Marcus Carter. In that book, we're writing about virtual reality, and one of the things that we say is virtual reality, you can apply this to AR and other technologies that are quite similar, is one of the most intensive sensors, invasive sensors that any of us who might be using it are inviting into our homes over the next decade, right? And I think that many people are just not thinking about the technology in this kind of way. So thinking here about the way that these devices are incredibly reliant on the capture of biometric data. They're increasingly incorporating a suite of AI features, neural technologies, and so on. So I think to kind of actually answer the question that Joe asked, the privatized internet over the last 20, 30 years is one that has been, it's reliant on a surveillance-based business model. And I think the key lesson here is to really try and ensure that doesn't happen again with technologies that are so sensitive, like AR and VR and emerging suite of smart glasses.
Okay, Millie?
I'm going to talk about adoption. When we look at social media and platformizations over 20 years, you'll see that certain environments considered social media platforms as secondary sites or distractions. So looking at it through the lens of productivity, these were things that kind of weren't adopted as an integral part of that particular environment. And I'm going to use news houses to illustrate that, something I'm familiar with and something we all consume on a daily basis. When social media platforms came along, they were either ignored, considered to be something that was of a distraction to journalists, and now they're being used in the same way as this thing to advertise, thing to prop, and again, not enriching the experience of that particular space. Now, if we put that into the logic of XR and other immersive technologies, we're seeing that they can run the risk of becoming this proverbial secondary site to these environments, because essentially they may not be addressing inherent needs within that environment, addressing inherent needs and inclusivity of that particular environment. And so if we're going to learn from platformization, we need to understand that XR is a technology and it needs to be considered essential for it to be impactful.
Okay, great. And I just want to clarify that I told my team the questions I'd ask, but I don't know what their answers are going to be, and so I'm just as interested as you all to hear.
So what I'm going to speak to are users, so who is using XR and who is not using XR, and the second part is especially critical for a lot of us. In our team, something that we particularly look at very often is around accessibility, inclusion, disability, women users. And this is really important for XR because for a lot of new technologies, we feel they are developed for a very specific kind of user and a very specific template of user that doesn't really include the diversity of use cases and the diversity of user profiles. Thinking about the internet in the last 20 years of social and online media, we've seen in recent years a lot of retrofitting and a lot of bandage solutions to problems that could have very easily been avoided if technology developers have spoken to or thought of the diversity of users, for example, disabled users. We've heard many times at this conference that designing for accessibility and designing for inclusion in mind often leads to a better product. And on the opposite spectrum, when you design without thinking of accessibility, for users it often leads to a very frustrating bandage, patchwork experience. And this is especially more amplified for technologies like XR, like VR, like AR, when they are more embodied and more dependent on your physical frame than ever. You think of like headsets, you think of glasses, you think of things that rely on an infrastructure and a network of different technologies. Something that I feel is really important is that XR continues to learn from the mistakes that social media has made in the past. To steal an anecdote from some of the research that we've been doing, we spoke to this one VR game developer who mentioned to us that he didn't think of left-handed users when he was developing his game. But after he realized that, and after receiving some feedback that, you know, left-handed users exist, they want to play the game too, he actually found it almost impossible to retroactively add in support for left-handed users because it required rebuilding his game from the ground up. And these are problems that we've recurrently encountered. It's an old story. It occurs with every single new iteration of technology that emerges, that technology has to be built more accessibly and with consideration of more diversity.
Okay, so I want to tease out in there what you've spoken about, sort of, you've identified some risks that we could replicate in XR, we've seen in other technologies. Can you just, very quickly, because I want to talk about good governance and getting ahead of these problems, but tell me, can you tease out or make explicit what is at risk if we do replicate it or if we don't do something about the potential for these problems to occur? Yeah. We'll go the same order. Ben, on privacy and data.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, so I think it's much the same thing, right? It's like large incumbent, largely platform companies who are operating in this space, who have other businesses elsewhere. The accumulation of data flows to those companies and they can use it for whatever purpose they see fit, whether that's to empower, an advertising arm or whether it's to feed into the suite of AI products that now exist. But the other thing I just want to point to here is I think there's the kind of like platform, like thinking about this in what I would call in my work the political economy of technology level, which is kind of to do with institutions. I think that's important, and I think we should absolutely be thinking about it, thinking about how to mitigate against those harms. But it's also, I think, incredibly important to think on like sort of the micro level, on like the level of actual people and the effects that the kind of misuse, or just maybe use of these technologies might have. So I'm thinking, I've sort of done a bunch of work where I've spoken to people about, and looked at like sort of a variety of different VR products that are used largely for like training or education. And what they're essentially trying to do is gather data from the user and operationalize that in a way to perhaps make some sort of inference about their ability to evaluate them or something like that. And there's this example that I often go back to and that I also discuss in the book here, Fantasies of Virtual Reality, where one company described VR data specifically as like total, perfect, and complete, right? This idea that like VR data is the best kind of data because it allows us to, it presents us the most complete picture of the person. And I think that that's a really problematic way of thinking about data. Data, we often think, we often hear this description of data as like raw data. Data is raw. It's the stuff that we can use to make a claim about a person, and we know that it's going to be true because data is neutral. And like that's just simply something that's not true, right? And the great response to that from I think the academic Lisa Gittleman, she says, data is never raw, it's always cooked, by which she means it's shaped by the kind of social circumstances in which it's used. So I think we really do need to be thinking quite carefully about not only like the macro level, the way the institutions are using data for whatever, but also the ways that they're used and have impacts on actual people's lives in the way that might be actually quite harmful.
Okay, Millie?
Yeah, I'm going to build up on what Ben was saying about data. Immersive tech is being presented as a tool for enhancement. And in the arena of productivity, it's essentially a tool for enhancing training, a tool for enhancing more of the experiential elements and social impact. And these types of technologies are being developed further based on data essentially being perceived as perfectly objective. And if we are going to perceive that data as perfectly objective, we are running the risk of addressing certain needs and not others. And by only addressing certain needs and not others, we may be also enhancing essentially more negative repercussions of introducing such technologies into these environments. So perhaps enhanced discrimination, enhanced bias, increased surveillance. And so we certainly are running the risk, again, of this technology becoming, rather than a tool of enrichment, a tool that may become superfluous, if not dangerous, if we are not addressing these particular elements.
Okay, Wen-Chi.
And I'll just build on that a little bit more. I think something that is really critical in these ideas of exclusion and these ideas of discrimination and these ideas of imperfect data is that ultimately the people who will be harmed are the ones who are putting out the technology. When you don't consider the kinds of users that you are excluding, you are restricting the number of people who are going to be fascinated by and who are going to enjoy the product that you put out. I rely a lot on anecdotes, but for example, I use VR pretty frequently, but I hate using VR when I'm out in public. And in particular, it's because of the way that VR sticks to your face. When I'm wearing makeup, when I have hair in front of my face, I never want to use VR. It's so tedious, and it's something that I feel could have been very easily added on into the interface design if there was someone on the team who also wore makeup and found it to be an issue in how the headset was constructed and imagined. We can also think of like different kinds of interfaces. I dabble in VR headsets, so thinking of something like the big screen beyond, which is completely suctioned to your face, is such an uncomfortable and obnoxious experience to have. And I just sometimes wonder, who are you designing these kinds of technologies for? And why are you purposely trying to restrict your user base when you're creating such an uncomfortable technology? Of course, there are technical limitations. But what I want to emphasize is that ultimately, the harms are brought onto the people who are putting out the technology.
That's a really good point, and I was hoping one of you would touch on it. I think good governance is important for this technology, or any technology, to be successful, ultimately. But another element of that is that, well, speaking from Australia, where the government is very willing to regulate tech companies, when we think relative to the US, say, maybe not Singapore, you've got proactive government policymakers here as well. But XR is on the policy table in Australia. Ben and I have briefed policymakers this year on it. They are looking at it as a target for regulating. And so doing good governance gets ahead of it and positions you well to work with policymakers on laws and approaches that are in everybody's best interest. So I think good governance lowers political, legal risks as well. With that in mind, I just want to, we have 7 minutes, 8 minutes. So I want to just put to you what are the elements of good XR governance, and not just technical solutions, but cultural solutions, legal solutions, and sort of, can we talk about that as well? Let's start with Wen-Chi this time.
Yeah, of course. You might be able to guess from the thread that I've been progressing on, but I think a lot of good governance lies in collaboration. A lot of XR governance currently is very self-regulated. You rely a lot on industry stakeholders to decide what is good and what is bad for development. Part of that is government and collaborating with government. Part of that is collaborating with universities and people like us who are researching and speaking to people and sharing thoughts around the table to make sure everyone has a voice represented. We care about users a lot. Speaking to users is really critical in terms of making good governance decisions, because ultimately they are the ones who are at the other end of your product. Again, I have an anecdote. I research a lot on social virtual reality, and all of us do, pointing towards the book over there, Governing Social Virtual Reality. Rec Room is a social VR platform that is more or less dead right now, and part of the suite of decisions that led to its decline was a lot around content moderation, and poor decisions made in relation to content moderation that made its users feel really ostracized, like they weren't being heard. And a lot of the discourse around Rec Room, if you look at forums, if you look at social media, was around who are the Rec Room developers designing this application for, because it's definitely not the users, because they're not speaking to the users before making their decisions.
Millie.
Just nodding in agreement in terms of collaboration. And I think it's also reframing the narrative around governance. Governance is always appearing to be the stick, the thing that is going to regulate away from technological advancement. And essentially, we could reframe governance in and of itself to be the blueprint, the guardrail that assures that technological advancements are actually enhancing human life. It offers directional capacity. It offers a way to look at data. Collaboration and symbiotic relationship and that reframing of attitudes towards governance can essentially help developers look at data in a way beyond okay, so how is this data talking to a particular element of society? It's going to assist with what are the ethical questions that you need to ask to be able to address more elements of inclusivity, to reduce discrimination and other elements. How do you enhance productivity by actually addressing human need? And that's where governance can come in.
Before Ben provides his response, if anyone, I think there's a microphone, a roving mic somewhere. If anyone has a question, we'll have time after this. We'd love to hear your questions about our research or anything we've said today. But Ben, good governance.
Yeah, I guess two things. I think good governance needs to happen now, right? So to Joe's point earlier about being proactive, when I'm thinking about governance and I'm thinking about being proactive, I'm thinking about anticipatory governance. And there's this classic problem in one of the fields that I work in, science and technology studies, called the Collingridge dilemma. And it's this idea that it becomes really, it feels very difficult to think about governance when something's emerging. But it's actually a hell of a lot more difficult to do anything about it once that's entrenched in society. So I think it's really, really crucial, to go back to Wenqi's point earlier, that anticipatory work, I think, can really be done through that process of collaboration between different stakeholders across academia, industry, so on. But the other thing, I think, with governance, and as Joe mentioned before, we've done quite a bit of work with stakeholders in the tech industry who kind of work in the more policy-oriented space. We've worked with governments and government agencies. And I guess one of the things, when we've spoken to them, one of the things that often comes up is this idea that we need new tools for governing XR, and I'm always a bit surprised by that, because I don't think we do. I think in many ways, and if we're thinking in terms of laws and regulation, I think many of the laws and regulations that we already have on the books are actually pretty good at dealing with many of the harms associated with these kinds of technologies. So the problem here, though, is that I think what XR tells us is that some of these laws are in some ways not keeping up with changes in the wider technology space. So I'm thinking here of the fact that a relatively robust data and privacy law or regulation like the GDPR is essentially waved away if you you consent on a click wrap EULA. The question to whether that's actually consent, I think, is very questionable. And that becomes very problematic, I think, when you're dealing with these very, very intensive sensing technologies.
I think there is someone with a microphone. Yeah, go for it.
Hi. Well, my question is actually because I saw only one thing related to XR in Australia. That's some institute with VR, for education, and that's for kids. So my question is, since Australia is the first country to forbid young kids to use social media, which sounds quite harsh nowadays. So for us, VR, XR industry, do you think it'll be a problem that we want to go into Australia because we might face the same, governing or even more harsh governing over this technology?
I mean, I will answer that one. The policy is my space. Look, I don't think you're going to have a problem coming into Australia, but the government is going to demand that that your products is safe for children, and I don't think that's unreasonable. And when we say safe, we define that to mean not addicting. There's a capacity for parental oversight. There's a low chance of being open to being groomed, harassed, bullied. I think when, as Millie said, it's a matter of framing. You don't want your products to do these things either, I'm sure. And so it's about that, and that's the view that the government's they've been taking. They see similar problems, and like Ben said, we've got institutions and rules in place around those things, and they'll be applied to XR.
Thank you.
Any other questions? We've got, are we out of time? I think,
Sadly out of time.
well, we're happy to pick this conversation up out on the break as well. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.